worked in Alaska for a bit as a member of the Park Service. One day, we got a call about some illegal dumping on one of the local trails, so myself and another employee went out to investigate. We were fairly deep into the trails, not too many people around except for a few joggers. When we came around a turn on that path, as we were walking, my partner looked into the woods and said, "What the hell? There's a guy over there." About 20 yards away, there was a white guy with longish hair, crouched behind a bush and just staring at us. It was very strange to see him there. I remember just kind of going still, getting that fuzzy feeling you get from fear. Like I said, it's not like we weren't encountering folks out there. There was trail joggers, dog runners, generally just people on the move. The only folks that we'd seen trailside had set up a little place to relax and have a snack, clearly out in the open. All of these folks said hello as we passed and had a receptacle for their trash. This guy was none of those. He was clearly trying to hide from other people on the trail, and his demeanor just wasn't what you'd expect from someone outdoors. It kind of reminded me of Gollum from The Lord of the Rings, the creepy way he'd just crawl around. This guy looked like that, just wearing a lot more clothing. The long stringy hair really freaked me out too. We're in Alaska, so the last thing you're expecting to spot in the bush is a skinny little white guy. When my coworker nodded into the trees, I was half expecting a wolf, a bear, literally anything else but a person hiding. And that's when I remembered the crime at hand, the illegal dumping, and realized that hiding in the bush would fit the bill. No one's trying to get caught with a hefty fine for something so stupid. The man noticed that we noticed him. He immediately stood up and stretched out his arms in the air like he was enjoying the day. He then approached us, and it turns out that my coworker actually knew that man in the woods. He was a local builder or owned a construction company. In fact, he'd built a deck for my friend the year prior. After they said their hellos, he mentioned that he just stepped off the path for a moment to take a leak. It was definitely strange though, because we'd seen him. That definitely wasn't what he was doing. But he wasn't that suspicious, and my coworker knew him, so after making sure he wasn't illegally dumping anything, we started walking back. He actually walked with us for a fair while. The best way I can describe this man is like a chameleon. Just one of those people who will do or say anything to just agree with you. The type of guy who desperately wants you to like him. He told us about his construction company, how business was going. When we didn't seem that interested, he told us about his career in the military. That struck me as off, considering the behavior we just witnessed. What was an army vet doing squatting out in the woods, watching people on a trail? It seemed like a red flag, but again, the guy made an effort to charm us, so I didn't think anything else about it. When we asked if he'd seen anyone illegally dumping anything, he went into these theatrics about all the manner of stuff that he'd seen. It seemed over-exaggerated, even made up, as he threw up his arms around and told us about this and that. Mostly stranger men and women on the trails at night, chasing people, unloading garbage by the truckload. A few years later, I heard that the man that we'd seen had been arrested. Apparently there'd been some sort of altercation with a girl at a coffee shop, or so I'd initially been told. He shot her in a robbery and then was under arrest for murder. The truth was even more bizarre. The man, Israel Keys, was a serial killer who'd actually abducted, tortured, and murdered the girl. After being arrested, it turns out that he'd been traveling around the country, murdering people randomly for years. He would bury murder kits and then come back sometimes years later to dig them up. They would include guns, cash, etc., whatever he needed. My coworker had the best theory. He thought that the initial call about the illegal dumping was someone who'd seen Keys digging a hole to bury his murder equipment. After he realized that he'd been spotted, and some of the equipment in that hole would likely be traced back to him and multiple crimes, he decided to intercept whoever came to investigate. That way he could keep an eye on where they went and ultimately turn back around for them. If that were the case, his plans worked perfectly and would also explain why he walked with us for so long. He was ensuring that we didn't double back and accidentally find his half-buried bag of bloody tools. I went back later to where we come across Israel in those woods to see if there was any such kit buried there, but I didn't find anything. Others suggested he might have been waiting to surprise a victim on the trail, but that didn't seem like his general MO, as was my understanding. Anyways, our encounter is something I've never totally been able to explain, and since he killed himself before the trial, I likely never will. Honestly, it's probably for the best. That guy allegedly abducted and murdered somewhere in the ballpark of 11 men and women, teenagers, even children. He traveled the country seemingly at random, didn't keep a victim profile in the sense that people he chose had no significance. It seemed to be a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, kind of like how we encountered him out there in those woods. Israel was an incredibly violent and accomplished killer. He did home invasions, set buildings on fire, executed bank robberies, and that was all on top of abducting and assaulting women in various states. He eluded authorities for at least 15 years, maybe even longer. When I was younger, I volunteered for the search and rescue in the town I lived in. I was a hiker by nature anyway, had some knowledge of the local terrain, so it just made sense to volunteer my time when necessary. The region I lived in wasn't known for high-profile missing persons. We did have consistent missions through the late summer and fall, which is when I would get tapped the most. One autumn, I got the call on a person who disappeared relatively recently. He was with a group who returned from a hike without him and immediately called it in, rather than look for him. Volunteers got the call on these missions a lot because of the quick turnaround and somewhat light nature of it. These people usually just turned around or got off the trail a little bit, maybe even injured. It was a very high probability for a successful extraction, so they got all hands on deck as quickly as possible. All volunteers were assigned to the park rangers or search and rescue operations. They split us up in groups of 3 to a lead, which divided out into 20 even groups of 4. There are a lot of heads bobbing in the dark looking for this guy. Our team works a sloping ridge that takes us back onto a plateau. A lot of us know this wedge pretty well, and they have us moving in your standard grid search. There's walkie-talkie chatter and distant beams of light throughout the canyon, spread out every quarter mile. We quickly recognize the lights that are moving as search and rescue, and the lights that are stationary as campers or ranger stations. We're on the lookout for any big fires or strobing lights reminiscent of an SOS. Hikers get creative when they're lost overnight. Our lead is on contact with the teams east and west of us. Then they switch channels for the overall contact between all teams. It was a super organized unit back then, and it made me proud to be involved, even if I was only fair weather. Weekend warriors is what they would call us, although I distinctly remember this mission was on a Tuesday night. Whatever the case may be, our team of 4 felt like we were going to be one of the ones to find this guy. Call it a hunch, but we just had a feeling that he was in our square of the grid. It was all an alluring little pass along the foot of the mountains. From the base, it looks like a simple, gentle slope, something that promises a great view. The reality was, it was steep, jagged, and much further down than it looked. This ridge had switchbacks that could make you think one direction was the other. Once you got to the plateau, it was so flat and wide, you'd think you were on the foot of the mountain, not at the 7,000 feet elevation. Also, we could hear something moving in the brush periodically. Off-trail was pretty overgrown, so in a dead silence, you could hear someone walking a quarter mile away. We'd stop now and again and listen, and to all shout his name together a couple of times. We thought we might have heard a response once, real faint, and up the ridge from us. Once we got to the top of the plateau, we could hear the stomping around in the tree line ahead. Animals aren't going to do that with a group of humans just a few hundred yards off, sweating, yelling, and shining flashlights. The animals are long gone by the time we even entered the area. We're confident whatever was cruising around was human. But as we crested the lip and got onto the flatland, the radio channel buzzed with all kinds of chatter. A group across the canyon found him along a dry spillway, pretty much the opposite of where we thought he was going to be. We were glad he was recovered, no injury and en route to treatment. But we were a little disappointed after hyping ourselves up. Plus, there was the stomping around the trees that we heard. All of us linger along the ridgetop and just listen, waiting to hear whatever it was again. It never sounded again though, and after 10 minutes of looking at the stars, we began the slow descent back down to the trailhead, where the command post was set up. Once we got about halfway down the face, we'd actually be able to see spotlights to guide us the last mile or two. As we approached that halfway point, we could see a light much closer to us, maybe just a few hundred yards down the face. We weren't navigating by a map trail, but a series of game trail switchbacks that got us to the top much faster. As we climbed, we moved out in a spread formation to comb the area, but since he'd been found, we just came down as a unit. We stopped when we saw the light. It was eerily bright. One of the other volunteers suggested that maybe it was the group to the east of us, lagging behind and just waiting. They could probably see our lights zigzagging through the trees on our slow descent. It wasn't uncommon for teams to rendezvous on return trips or even during a search. It could get creepy and lonely out there in the dark. The more the merrier is always the philosophy. The park ranger we're with, links into the channel shared only teams east and west of us. He reports in and asks if there's another team near the position that we can see. A moment goes by. They respond, and it's clear as day. These guys are 2 and 3 miles ahead of us, respectively. One group has pretty much made it back to the command post, and the other is all but 30 minutes out. We say thanks and then kill the radio, then collectively look back down at the light waiting for us. What the hell is that? I couldn't help but ask. I was the janitor guy on our team, and my experience just got the best of me. It turned out no one had a good answer, and we were all a little rattled. Even the park ranger, and he lived here. But just as we begin to descend again, the light clicks off, totally disappears. No moment, no flicker, no fade, just gone. We all shook our heads and pushed into the darkness. A couple of us actually turned on additional headlamps and handlights, just in spite of the light that vanished. We hit the area that we estimated the light had to have been positioned, but there isn't any evidence of anything. There's no trash there, no litter, smoke, tracks, or anything else. We even scanned the trees just to be sure. We all had shared that feeling that I would call dread. All 4 of us were talking about how we couldn't wait to get off the mountain. The anxiety was almost palpable. I got to talking with another volunteer. We got a little distracted as we walked. We were comparing thoughts on that weird crashing that we'd heard earlier, and the weirder lights coming and going below us. The other guy was probably the most freaked out of any of us, and was totally convinced both events were correlated. He thought human traffickers got the guy at first, then Bigfoot once we heard the crashing, and now UFOs with the light vanishing. His theories were all over the place, but I wanted to backboard some ideas off somebody. Meanwhile, the ranger and the other guy got ahead of us about 100 yards. As we're hiking along, a loud sound emits from the tree stand to our left, and both our little groups immediately stop. Me and the other guy start hustling to catch up, speed walking as quickly as possible as the terrain will allow us to. Just as we're closing the last 50 yards, both me and the other volunteer stop in our tracks again. There was another sound to our left, but this one was so much closer. So close that only he and I could hear it. Someone, very faintly in the trees, whispered, "Hey," at us. It was so quiet, but so clear. We had no choice but to freeze. Who was trying to get our attention at 1 a.m. in the middle of nowhere? We can't help but turn around and look. And here's where it gets a little speculative, because he and I didn't see the same thing. From where I was positioned a few feet behind him and to the right, and he had a direct line of sight. We both stand there for a minute before this guy yelps and cries out, then totally collapses into the underbrush. We both were just standing there for a minute, and then all of a sudden, this guy yelps and cries out, totally collapses into the underbrush. He's backpedaling as fast as he can, scrambling on all 4s like a crab. His lights are cutting in every direction, which leads to the chaos and prevents me from seeing anything further than him falling down. I help him to his feet, just as the ranger and the other volunteers come running over. They both had guns drawn, clearly way more prepared than myself. They ask what happened, to which I just looked at the guy I was talking to and shrugged. We explained the first part together, that we heard someone whisper, "Hey," and then all three of us listened to the rest. He says he turned to the trees after the whisper. He was looking back and forth along the trunks. He was expecting someone to step out from somewhere 10 feet away, based on the sound of the voice. As he's looking, he sees movement, but nothing he expected. He said a person began crawling on the forest floor, quickly, and moving right toward him. He said they were only 5 or 6 feet away, but right in front of him, looking straight up. He had seen their eyes reflecting on the light the whole time, but just thought it was sap. It wasn't. It was some muddled, naked weirdo. They blended into the dirt and pine needles perfectly, and by the time the guy got to his feet, that person was gone. We did a sweep of the area, called out a few more times, but found no sign of anyone. It was cool weather for the season, so a naked person like that would have had to have been on drugs. It was the only thing that explained the behavior. The whole thing was crazy because I sure as hell heard that whisper too. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility for there to be a person to go with that voice. After finding nothing, we kept pushing down the mountain, but now with a real drive to get the hell out of those woods. We're all but spilling over one another, all asses and elbows in a bid not to be last. No one wanted to be the one with darkness chasing behind them. The ranger radioed down, asked if there were any other missing persons in that area for the night, but of course, nothing. Mission is over. He doesn't bother reporting whatever the volunteers saw. We all just agree to tell them when we got back. It takes us much less time now that we're huffing toward the command post. We didn't see anything else, and after we made our report, a second team was almost dispatched to go have a look, but ultimately was called off. If there was anyone else, they'd have to be called in first. Never heard anything else about the light or that creepy crawler in the woods, but it for sure made one crazy ass night. I've worked as a pack trip outfitter, ranch hand in the middle of the national forest, and spent at least a week each month camping. I'm doing dog mushing now, so I'm outdoors now in times when it's colder and darker, and further into places that people don't often go. Most people would consider a 25-mile horse trip to be very long. In fact, it would probably be all day. I'll do from 40 to 80 miles a day to get the dogs in shape for the Iditarod and Yukon quest. I'm not directly with search and rescue or with the park rangers, but I volunteered alongside them both, spent countless hours assisting them inside the deep wilderness. I've never met a person that didn't log these kind of miles who didn't see or hear some unbelievable stuff. It's par for the course, but just how much of it you entertain is up to you. I don't believe in half the stuff I hear about, mostly just what I see with my own eyes. My story that I'm going to tell you is a two-parter, with the first part being just past the New Mexican border into Arizona. I was driving on old county highways, and the sun had just slipped into dusk. In between the light makes it harder to judge shadows and distances. It's when most accidents happen. I'm not driving that fast, I'm just going the speed limit because I'm in the middle of nowhere. If I clip something, it's going to be a while before anyone finds me, if I even survive at all. Once the sun is totally gone, I plan on picking the speed back up. That's when I see 5 or 6 elk cows burst onto the road, and I slam onto the brakes and swerve all the way off the shoulder. I almost collided with rocks and all kinds of stuff along the road, rather than hit this herd. It's almost a certain death sentence to collide with one of those animals. They stand 6 or 7 feet tall, weigh over 500 pounds, and they breed like rabbits in some places. I might survive hitting one, but all 5? No way. Luckily for me though, I dodged them, but I still almost hit this one elk that was bigger than all the rest. It looked like it was going to hit me straight on and crash into me through the front windshield, killing me instantly. Like I heard happen to some guy in Deming when he hit a horse. It was one of the worst deaths I could imagine. Hard, fast, and then just being crushed to death. The glass would probably shred me too. I felt this really calm feeling and thought it would be the end. Everything felt slow. I got a good look at it. It's so weird how natural it is to surrender when death feels unavoidable. Many of us have this idea that we're going to go out swinging, but the truth is, we accept it when it's coming. The only scary part was that it was looking back at me too. It was about the size of a moose. It had no antlers of any kind, and the build of a typical female. The other animals were common elk cows, but this one was larger and covered from head to toe in what looked like large gray wool. Like an Angora goat that needed shaving so bad that it started to look like dreadlocks. And by larger, you have to understand the dimensions. An elk can average 500 pounds, but a female moose averages closer to 900. This animal lumbering along with the herd was twice the size of any animals, to put it into perspective. And the elk were already bigger than my car. No wonder it was so hard to avoid. It literally took up every inch of the 2-lane road that I was on. Luckily, I get past it though. I see its head go over the roof of my shitty Ford Taurus, and then it hit the back of my car. The part I remember best is passing under it, because for one instant, I felt this weird connection with this thing, like we knew that we were looking at one another, despite the dead gray wads of fur hanging in its face. I skirted to a stop and jumped out of the car immediately, despite my better judgment. I was standing in awe. I needed to see what the hell that thing was. The elk were moving into the tree line, and whatever I saw was right behind them. Everything just disappeared into the brush. I walked back to the front of my car to inspect the place where I hit it, and sure enough, there's a brand new dent in the metal. I leaned on my car with my hands on my head for like 20 minutes, just replaying it over and over in disbelief. My friends think it was some kind of Sasquatch, even though I'm certain it had 4 legs, so we'll just call it Bigfoot's horse. My wife says it was probably the spirit of death, and that I died there but continued living on in what my mind wants to happen. The second part is that I was a few miles up the ridge that overlooked Lake Strawberry in Utah. I got to this old aspen grove, with really thick aspens on both sides. I mention this because with a string of 12 dogs behind an ATV, as there wasn't enough snow for the sleds, there's really nowhere to go but forward. You couldn't guide the dogs through the trees like that, so it was always forward until we got to the end of the loop that would bring us back to the trail and then back to base camp. Which was an exciting thought, because I'm usually using a headlamp, and it was late and cold. We'd more than accomplished the routes that I wanted to that day. Now it was just about getting back. Suddenly, I saw it again, running on my left side. It was going in the same direction as us, but also toward us at an angle. If we kept going, we would collide after about 50 yards. Again, I was reminded of the magnificent power of the moose. This thing was just barreling through 2 or 3 foot snowdrifts like they were nothing. The amount of strength it showed was unreal, and it was matted in that same thick fur as the other one from Arizona. That's the first thing that came to my mind. The other one I saw was a few years before, and roughly 900 miles away. There's no way I was looking at that same creature that I saw in the Arizona backcountry. This was a different thing up here in the Utah high country. I wish I would have grabbed a camera, but I was caught up in the franticness of watching my dogs to make sure they didn't chase toward it. In dog mushing, you can never take your eyes off your leader too long, or something can go terribly wrong. And to stop the team would make them for sure go toward it and get caught in the trees. So really the best thing you can do was just go faster. Keep the dogs busy so they don't chase. This also meant I might put some distance between myself and whatever the hell that thing is. It still was crashing through snowbanks and branches as it galloped through the tundra. There's only 25 yards between us and a few sparse trees, bare of any leaves or cover. So I'm looking at it, at the pack leader ahead of the team, because a fallen tree or cattle guard taken too fast can injure a dog just like a moose. I look back at the creature, then reach in around my emergency bag, then look back at the leader, pull out my just-in-case gun. It's a 6-shot .357 revolver with buffalo bore cartridges. I click off the first 2 chambers I keep empty. I have the gun pointed straight up in the air with live ammo now. I really didn't want to shoot it, or even frighten the dogs with a gunshot, but it keeps getting close. So I fire a shot a few feet above it, and hear the bullet hit some branches, and then look back at the dogs. Just as I do that, I see it go behind a thick grove of trees in my periphery. I kept looking around, but that was the last I saw of it. Although the rest of the ride, I was jumping at shadows. As a hunter, dog sledder, and volunteer search and rescue guide, I still don't know what to make of it. It's got 4 legs and what looks like decades worth of coat growth. It doesn't need to be able to see to move. It shouldn't exist, yet I've seen it twice. Pretty crazy, but the craziest thing was that tiny moment I thought, oh shit, it's death again. But this time, he's gonna take me for real. I worked in Big Bend National Park back when I was a kid. We were prepping for a backpacking series presentation for REI. This was a big event for the company and other outdoorsy companies, mostly photographers, who were going to come and test the equipment, and then showcase their own. We were tasked with securing a large campsite for them that had to meet certain parameters. They needed views of the sunrise and sunset, needed to be near flowing water, and they didn't want another camper within 3 miles of them. Big Bend is in the western portion of Texas that dips down along the bend of the Rio Grande that forms the border with Mexico. It's mixed high desert, smaller mountains, has great history. Just for anyone unclear on the region. Since we work the park, we know which places are busier than others, which campsites have access to better vantage points. We set out in a couple of teams to go survey the areas to see which would be best. It didn't take long, thankfully, and left us with a free afternoon. REI offered to let us test some of the equipment on ship, but beyond that, we stayed mostly uninvolved. We broke up into groups based on interest. Pretty much everyone wanted to swim. A couple of guys wanted to fish, and then there was a trail system nearby that I'd been meaning to check out. I was hiking the area near a place we dubbed the Unknown Canyon. This was on account of a series of random grave markers found along the canyon floor, all chiseled with a single date, and then simply the words, unknown person or unknown child. It sounds far more nefarious than it really is. Early road makers discovered corpses in the area that they accidentally disturbed while digging into the mountainside. Rather than scatter them into the elements, they took careful measures to relocate the remains to a beautiful little glen throughout the valley. This is why they had stone and mortar to make the headstones. It's a cool, creepy piece of the history around here. This was so long ago, and I'm sure the canyon has a different name now. The area of the park opens up into a comparatively flat section of the basin, where the river broadens and the wildlife tends to be more diverse and obvious there. It was a mild, safe area for me to poke around with my camera. I didn't have to worry about getting tripped up or needing a free hand. I even snapped a couple of photos of the unknown gravestones that I came across. I was several hundred meters away from the ranger truck, which was parked in a designated lot at what passed for a trailhead at the time. This area was open to guests and visitors, but wasn't easily accessed by your average hiker. You needed to know which creek to follow, and then which game trail to splinter off. And a portion of the descent is almost straight up and down if you don't know how to properly navigate it. As I approached the river basin near the mouth of the canyon, I saw something really unusual. So unusual, in fact, that it took a few seconds for my brain to sort that puzzle. Something was moving on the other side of the river, and it was big, man-sized, but low to the ground. As it shuffled along, the color of it made me think it was a group of rabbits, but there was no way, it was too big. As I moved forward to improve my visual on it, it began to look even stranger. For a second, I thought I was looking at a medium-sized deer, doing the worm across the canyon floor. I must be hallucinating, there's no other options. Only after blinking and refocusing my eyes can I behold exactly what I'm seeing. It was a mountain lion, a big cat. It was creeping along, low-slung, hunting something that was probably no more than a stone's throw from where I was standing. I'd never seen one before, and when the visual information finally parsed, I think my blood froze. Then, it looked at me, and I'll probably never forget that bit. You could see the little calorie calculator turn on in its eyes. I've never been so thankful for a river in my entire life. Granted, at this time, and even maybe still, the river was very low due to drought and unauthorized and unlawful irrigation practices upstream, and you could likely cross at several points at this location with very minimal risk. It was still quite broad and definitely looked the part of a potent water barrier though. The cat does a series of double takes, head shifting to me, then to the prey's location, back and forth rapidly. I could actually see it weighing the risk versus the reward, trying to get a fix on this evening's menu. I died a little inside, maintained my facing, and began slowly and quietly moving away from it. I do have bear spray on my belt, but I have little to no confidence being before such a predator. Not sure if I wasn't worth it, or if the river was too much of an X factor, or if the biggin just really wasn't that into me. But no chase was given, and after breaking the line of sight, I was able to get back to the van just fine with no sign of pursuit. That was the longest short walk I've ever taken. Later on that night, I was parked off the main park road in the area where big cats commonly hunted. I'll always remember being parked there, in the middle of nowhere, munching on slightly stale Oreos and a bottle of water, listening to the occasional growl or scream of a big cat peel out of the darkness, and being thankful for my relatively fortunate position on our food chain. I was hiking with a group, spread out naturally based on hiking speed. We were on a day training hike that would take us to the next station over. I was in the middle of a group of 4, and one person had to stop to pull a tick off. The other 2, one being a lead ranger, stayed with them. I decided to hike ahead and see if I could catch up with the lead group. The trail we were on is extremely well marked, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. I left them behind for a fear of the ticks. In my mind, where there's one, there's 10,000 more hanging in the leaves around you. Despite my choice of career and pastimes, ticks and leeches are some of my top fears. I didn't want to be the next one having to burn them off my neck and thighs. I knew the next landmark was an old logging road, and sure enough, I hit it about a half a mile later. I decided I should wait for the rest of the group and catch up. So while waiting, I hiked a bit down the old overgrown road, which ran perpendicular to the trail. There was a low stone wall along one side that I was just strolling alongside it, checking for anything interesting, like artifacts and stuff like that. Then all of a sudden, it felt like I just crossed this invisible line. It was like the sound cut off too. No birds or insects called. Seconds ago, there had been multiple birds singing. Even leaves on the trees around me stopped rustling. It was just this sudden, unnatural, deafening silence. For whatever reason, I took a few more hesitant steps until I hit this invisible wall. I was suddenly barraged by this feeling, and I can only describe it as this intense, unwelcome feeling, as if I'd entered the house of someone I knew that hated me, but multiplied by 100. All the hairs on my body stood straight up. I stopped dead in my tracks. That feeling was so strong that I didn't even want to turn my back. I couldn't see anything down the road, nothing threatening or otherwise that would give me all these feelings, but I knew I had to leave there immediately. I just knew I was not meant to be there. If I stayed, something bad would happen. So I started walking backwards, slowly, never turning away from the road, and trying really hard not to even blink. Finally, I crossed that invisible line again. I could hear the birds singing and the leaves rustling. I didn't turn around until I heard the leader I'd left earlier asking me if there was anything cool down that road. I was like, nope, let's keep going. Looking back, I figure it was just a bear or a cougar, maybe out of sight, and my instincts managed to pick up on it. But at the time, damn, it was just a really creepy feeling, almost paranormal. I let the rest of the team know, but everyone generally just let it slide. What we were gonna do, go hike around until we found it? There's animals in the woods, it's that simple. We reached the next station and had a really cool weekend, learning about various plant life and field triage training. I completely forgot about that weird experience in the forest, and when anyone asked, just said it was the time I thought I was close to a predator. It wasn't until next summer when I had to complete the same hike to that same station with a different team of rangers. Half of them were vets, people that had worked and lived in that park for more than 10 years. The hike was a breeze because all of us newbies got to ask questions and hear wild stories. One of the older rangers, I'll just call him Rick, had a bunch of stories of run-ins with different predators. It reminded me of last year when I had that creepy experience in the woods. I spoke up and told my story, how it happened and on this exact trail, how much it lined up with Rick's encounters, how everything got still, and how loud your heartbeat sounded in the moment. But when I told him about the vibe, Rick didn't really comment. The conversation then got redirected. We started talking about something else. I thought that was kind of weird, and when I looked at him, he had this faraway look. He gave me this weird nod when he noticed me looking at him, like we would talk later. Sure enough, when we reached the station and broke camp for that day, Rick came to find me. He apologized for clamming up and explained he wanted to speak in private. I said okay, and we moved off, made a little distance between us and the rest of the group. The first thing he asked was where exactly I thought my story happened. I told him where I went, the old overgrown road. Rick told me he'd also explored that road in both directions. One way was a dead end after a quarter mile, where a rock slide had completely erased wherever the road once led. It looked more like an old stagecoach pass that way, with matching ruts chewed into the earth. Another year, he explored it the other way, the same direction I did. Rick said he followed the low rock wall until he found a nice place to relax for a bit, but found himself overwhelmed with the same feelings of dread. It wasn't just silent and eerie. Rick said it was like every fiber of his being was screaming at him to walk the other way. He got out of there, but was way more perplexed about what he felt than I was. I'd never encountered predators, so I didn't really know what to expect. Rick had, and this wasn't like being near a bear or a lion. It was like there was something in the air telling him to run. Nothing instinctual, but actually suggestive somehow. It reminded Rick of something he heard about. Rick had served briefly in the US Army before becoming a park ranger. During his service, he'd heard about various military technologies, a lot of them partially confidential because of their experimental nature. One thing he'd heard about was a non-lethal energy weapon called an access denial system. This was something that could be carried or installed somewhere and would emit waves at a certain frequency and make any environment uninhabitable. If one of these was placed above a doorway, for example, you would not be able to pass through it until it was turned off. You wouldn't be able to tell why, but something would subconsciously keep you from wanting to enter. Just like how we felt when we went down that road. Rick had always been fascinated with government technologies, and because he had a back catalog of knowledge, he was actually able to deduce exactly what we felt. He explained it in a way that clicked. It did feel like a frequency, something all around me when I stepped into it. My desire to go back the way I came was palpable. I was excited. I asked him what we did next. Who could we take that information to? And I'll never forget the defeated half smile that he gave me as he patted me on the shoulder. He said there was nothing we could do. He'd tried once and gotten nowhere. At the end of the day, who do you take that kind of story to? The police? The press? There's no way to prove your story, and as you say it, you sound a little crazy. I was in complete disbelief. He just wanted to compare notes with me and clue me in on what his theory was. That whatever was at the end of that old road was supposed to be classified, I guess. Rick said there have been a number of people over the years making the same report, and no investigation ever happens. Most of them were in the Southwest, whereas we were a little farther north. Either way, what did it matter? He also explained that investigating too much was a mistake. He followed a story or two, where some of these folks who'd made reports ended up disappearing after going back to see what was out there. I only worked at the park for another year before transferring, but I've never forgotten what happened that day. I was working as a camp worker when this happened to me. Other than just me, there was a Navajo guy there my age also working. We'll call him Josh. Our job was to look after the horses and campers, make food, and keep the site clean for the next set of campers. The company that we worked for had emergency rifles set up in the trailer that we used, along with 2 guard dogs. The most common visitors that we had were forest rangers. They'd come by periodically, every couple of days at least, and check on long-term campsites. We were on a first-name basis with these guys, and would usually have a pot of coffee waiting for them whenever they rolled through. Working in the wilderness, it's nice to have some sporadic company. Almost makes it feel normal. One night after a long trail ride, we'd gone back to camp only to discover there was a single coyote patrolling it. We watched it from a distance before it saw us and then scurried off. I don't know why, but Josh had this really bad feeling after seeing it. The other workers didn't really seem bothered, but they weren't the ones who had to live on the site 24/7 like we did. Maybe it was just nerves, but Both of us had this feeling of being watched that entire evening. So eventually, night comes and we all fall asleep. We wake up to a banging on our door and someone wailing outside. We get up to investigate. Josh goes and checks the blinds. He sees it's a camper and he lets them in. They come inside and they're completely terrified. They tell us that one of the girls that they were with had heard a sound which sounded like one of her friends outside her, only to step on her as she was making her way outside of the tent. That's when the wailing began, which woke all of them up. It apparently had gone on for 20 or so minutes before they came to wake us up. As they're telling us this, the wailing stops, then promptly starts back up in a different spot, much closer to the camping site. This time, we notice the dogs are with us bristling, so both of us are not being very brave. We took down the rifle and exited the trailer. We brought the dogs with us, leashed, and let them lead us to the center of camp. From here, you could tell the sound was coming from just beyond the edge of lantern light, where the area was pitch black. We gather some of the wood sitting next to us, start the fire back up, and that's when it gets bad. I've never been more terrified in my life than when I was right now. As soon as the wood catches, from all around us, the wailing stops. The dog just stands next to us, growling really hard, but their tails are tucked. They know they're outgunned. I had absolutely no idea what was going on, so I chambered around into my rifle, in which my friend follows suit. After that, it goes dead quiet, and I mean dead quiet, like no sound being heard whatsoever. I don't know if it was from how scared I was or what, but the next thing I know, I hear my name being whispered from the tree line to my left. I'll fully admit it, I pissed my pants. It was and still the most terrifying moment of my entire life. I look at my friend. He's wide-eyed and his face is pale. He's looking between me and where my name had come from, just as terrified as I was, maybe if not more. We both back up closer to the campfire before he takes one of the burning branches and hurls it towards the tree stand. At this point, what few campers had followed us out into the dark are completely losing their minds. A couple of them heard the voice as well and saw us tossing flaming branches into the shadows, rifles raised. They can all tell something is very wrong. I look back at them for only a second, just in time to see them backpedal into the trailer and then slam the door. Not very cool, but I get it. We hear a weird sound and see something scurry away, only to have the dogs go completely ballistic. If there was anything left in my bladder at that point, it had come out. Just as I begin to take a step forward, I hear another voice. This time, it whispers Josh's name from straight ahead. It even said his full name. I look at my friend, but we're frozen. He points at something making its way slowly toward us. He points his rifle and fires at it, hitting whatever it was. After the initial shot, we kind of went crazy, firing at whatever made a sound inside that brush. The thing that we saw stalking out of the foliage was tall, person-sized. Everything we thought we saw after that was crawling. So we stayed outside of the trailer for the rest of that night until the other workers came up. They see us both, tired, still clutching the rifles, and ask what the hell happened. We go over everything, and they go out to investigate. One of them had a radio and contacted the forest rangers. The green truck came bumping out of the forest no more than an hour later. By noon, they came back with 2 dead coyotes. Apparently, what happened was the current set of campers had brought a large amount of meat to grill with, but hadn't properly sealed the containers, attracting the coyote pack. I definitely had some fantastical things going through my brain, ranging from skinwalkers to ghosts. To see the actual creature causing it all was completely surreal. The forest rangers noted the strangest part. One of the coyotes was very clearly dead from the massive bullet hole in its side from one of our rifles. The other coyote, however, didn't have any visible wounds. Definitely no bullet holes. Its face was locked in a crazy snarl, and all of its muscles were tense to the point of rigidity. No idea what killed it, like it just dropped dead during the onslaught. Josh was particularly spooked when he saw them and refused to tell me why. I suspect it had something to do with his personal beliefs, possibly Navajo culture, but I don't want to assume. The only thing he told me was that there should be a third corpse, the big standing thing he shot right in the chest. but there's nothing around. Coyotes can't talk. We both heard our names whispered that night. The amount of gore throughout the area was unbelievable. Blood and innards painted the ground, bushes, and even up and down trees. Josh said it looked like there was something among the pack, fighting them. Maybe that's what actually got them in a frenzy. The Rangers took down a report, but never got back to us with any more information. In 2016, my boyfriend, who's now my husband, and I went camping in eastern Pennsylvania. The place we decided to stop for the night was primitive. Camping was free, but no cell phone service, barely a road. We did encounter 2 other people. They might not factor into what happened later at all, but they were creepy, so I'm gonna describe them. The first was a woman who had her truck off to the side of the road, just as we drove past. She had the hood open and seemed to be waiting for someone to stop and offer to help. Usually my boyfriend had no problem helping someone, but he said this time something about her just put him off. She didn't really seem like she needed help, and usually people who need help look at you hopefully as you approach. She looked like she was just expecting that we would stop. At least that's what my boyfriend said. I really didn't notice anything strange about her. The next person came when we chosen a spot. We're setting up a fire for some hot dogs. I noticed some people drive by a few times, but my boyfriend pointed out each time was the same car and the same man, watching us each time he passed. My boyfriend was a little uneasy about this, but we'd driven around for a while before finding a place that we liked. It had been raining, everything was muddy. We wanted the driest site possible. He could have easily been doing the same thing. We briefly thought about moving, but the road was muddy too. If he wanted to find us again if we moved, all he had to do was follow the tracks. There were some other tracks, but not really many. He'd only have to backtrack a little to locate us once more. He didn't come by another time though, so we stayed and spent the several remaining hours before dark just goofing off. We didn't see anyone else drive by. Whether or not those 2 had anything else to do with this experience, the real fear came later. We'd gone to sleep in our tent, and sometime around 3 a.m., we were awoken by this very loud noise. I can't describe it very well, or even remember exactly what it sounded like, but my boyfriend said it reminded him of a chain gun revving up. It also sounded similar to how it would sound if someone recorded a shovel being dragged over gravel and played it over a loudspeaker, is another way he described it. He jumped up and looked out our little window, but couldn't really see anything. The sound repeated itself a few more times. I was too scared to speak. My boyfriend whispered it was probably miles off and just to go back to sleep. I didn't question him. I figured loud sounds could easily be heard miles off. But after we ended up leaving, he told me it sounded like it actually had been coming from just down the road, but didn't want to freak me out. Looking back, I probably should have wondered why he would bother to whisper if that sound was far off. I was still terrified though. Every little thing I heard outside sounded like someone was walking around the tent. We laid there for a little while longer when finally, he told me to get dressed because we're leaving. Immediately I got alarmed, and then I grew more alarmed when he unwrapped the machete that we brought for this trip from its plastic and then exited the tent. We quickly packed up and loaded the car. I looked around for footprints that weren't our own, but despite the moon providing plenty of light, I really couldn't see any. I did point out something my boyfriend hadn't noticed though before we got back into the car. There's a beer can by our dead fire that hadn't been there before. We didn't even bring beer. While driving away, my boyfriend explained that he was nervous someone might have been trying to lure us out, so he didn't think it was a good idea to run from the tent right away. He also half expected to find our gas tank had been siphoned dry, but that wouldn't have stopped us because thankfully we had a hybrid car. We joked that it would make a funny hybrid commercial. Number of brutal murders avoided by driving a hybrid. I think joking was the only thing keeping us from shitting ourselves from the fear and the adrenaline alone. On our way out, we did get a little lost, so it ended up taking a lot longer to get back to the forest road. We ended up passing into the national forest, which I guess we were in the whole time, where we passed a ranger station. The light was on and we needed directions anyway, so I decided to report what happened to us. The rangers were friendly enough, totally understood our concern. In fact, they've been having a number of people stop in with similar accounts. When we explained where we come from and had set up camp, they said it made sense. That area of forest was easily more accessible from the highway, so it was known for less than desirable activity. We thanked the rangers and then went on our merry way. The rest of our trip, we only stayed in well-populated campsites or got a hotel.